Our next speaker is Silvina Maestro. He'll be talking about levels of abstraction in art.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm an interdisciplinary artist and researcher working in the intersection of art, science, and philosophy. It is in this interdisciplinary spirit that I engage in the research I'm presenting you today. In recent philosophy of science literature, there has been a growing attempt to integrate the discussions, the historical and methodological commonalities of the natural sciences and fine arts. In this presentation, I aim to draw reflective comparisons between scientific examples in both art and science, focusing on the use of abstraction. I'm sure you'll recognize the image on the left. And on the right, it's my sculpture, Photosphere 1. The ideas for this presentation have their origin during the experience of working on this sculpture. I decided to investigate conceptually and explore practically the idea of black holes. And in doing so, I posed myself many questions in terms of how I could represent this object. Rather than go for something simply figurative, I decided to create something that would be a geometrical abstraction. These sparked a question about the levels of abstraction that can be engaged in both art and science, and a broader question about the shared methodologies of both disciplines. My journey of thinking about this led me to want to start looking at other artists that have engaged with levels of abstraction in art. I chose two seemingly different artists, Barbara Hepworth and Francis Bacon, who have both engaged with levels of abstraction in their work and think about their practices in relation to levels of abstraction in science. The view that art and science were trying to mimic nature remained mostly dominant until the advent of artistic avant-gardes in the 20th century, which provoked a revision in artistic theories of creation and representation. The interest in linking artistic and scientific representation increased with the emergence of the study of models in contemporary philosophy of science that started in the 1960s and gained momentum in the 80s and 90s. The emphasis of the non-linguistic character of models aided the establishment of links with artistic artifacts, such as paintings, photographs, or sculptures, with models such as scientific images, diagrams, scale models, or computed simulations. As with the old science, all conventions of representation were done away with, and mathematical abstractions seeped into the artistic consciousness. With the end of simple figuration, we find new ways of seeing the world and thus presenting it in art. Following the Aristotelian and Platonic traditions, for philosopher Van Frassen, both disciplines, being of a representation of nature, include many pragmatic elements that often rely on inaccuracy, and this allows for a plurality of interpretations. Scientific models are usually thought to represent phenomena when certain propositions they entail are true. However, this doesn't mean that the representational relationship is exhausted. Philosopher Baylor Jones presents the argument that science usually succeeds in the construction of representations of phenomena that are, however, rarely fully accurate. Mauricio Suarez tells us, for example, that we happily claim that Newtonian mechanics gives us a representation of the solar system, even when it's clear that if Newtonian mechanics is not corrected in general relativistic terms, it is empirically inadequate and non-isomorphic to the nature of planetary motion. Abstractions help us with a correct description of certain elements of nature, even when they might not describe all the characteristic relationships of the target phenomenon. Thus, we might see abstraction as producing false descriptions due to their exclusions and inaccuracies. For Suarez, similarity is not a constituent of the relation of representation. In mathematics, an equation and its physical signs written is as different as it is possible from the phenomena that it might represent. On a similar view, Goodman tells us that we don't expect mathematical equations to look similarly to acid bases or populations of organisms. In the case of art, Suarez identifies elements that might be contained in a work of art that look like some things in the world and are undeniably relevant to the theme of painting. In the case of Picasso, Guernica, for example, a bull, a hawk, or a crying woman. However, the similitudes in appearance are not a reliable aid to identifying what the target of representation of the work might be. There is a higher level of meaning that is being formed by these elements. There is an intangible target of the painting, the thread of fascism, that has nothing to do with the elements literally represented by a similarity. As Chakrabarty points out, the difference lies in the contrast between depiction and denotation, the main feature of representation in art, which is an analogy for the contrast of truth and mere reference as the main characteristic of representation in science. Guernica does not depict the thread of fascism, it denotes it. Abstraction permits for inaccurate representation that might in fact be closer to truth or allow for a better approximation to truth over time. There is a multiple realizability aspect shared by certain cases in both art and science. An element can be used to signify different things apart from the thing it resembles. Eric Coriel says, in maths, a mathematical structure might gain diverse kinds of physical significance upon being related to other mathematical structures in different ways. Equally, the target of the artistic artifact might differ from the literal elements it represents. Now I'm going to talk about the work of Barbara Hepworth and Francis Bacon, seemingly different artists, but both engaged in the use of abstraction with the aim to transcend the limitations of figuration in their work. Barbara Hepworth began her practice as a figurative artist. However, by 1930, she has started to think in abstract terms, recognizing in abstraction a means of transcending the trivial problems of the mortal mind and aiming for universality. He would see Hepworth's evolution from figurative into abstract work through her early years. Hepworth got inspired by scientific theories and mathematical models she had seen at Oxford University and began making plaster sculptures that integrated color and strength by 1939. These scientific models had been used to teach geometry, but had been abandoned as theories advanced, reaching a new audience after World War I in galleries and museum displays, where the artistic avant-garde found them as perfect inspiration for their abstract explorations in thinking, shape, and form. This is one of the ways the formal relations of mathematics and science had infiltrated the thought of the avant-garde. For Hepworth, working with abstraction was synonym with freedom, the only way to represent the real and intangible character of being. She found a connection between sculpture and the loss of science and their universality. Celestial bodies became a constant theme in Hepworth's practice after the landings in 1969, as she tried to express a new sense of poetry in a new scientific age. The repeated use of circles relates to her spirituality, connecting the celestial forms and her continued Christian faith. Plato in the Timaeus already talked about how the sphere is the most perfect and most uniform figure. The symbol of the divine mind in perpetual motion became the circle. This idea is based on the association of the circles representing the perfection and timelessness of God, who perceives all points in space at once, just like the center of the circle is in equal relation to all the points of the circumference. This is famously seen in Dante's Vita Nuova, ego tampon centrum circuli, cui simili modo se habent inconferentia verde. I am as the center of the circle, to which the parts of the circumference have a similar relation, were words spoken by the spirit of love to Dante. By piercing the form with circular shapes, Hepworth is not limited to the physical. She's sculpting not only with material, but she's also sculpting with space. Now, how is a spectator of the work able to decipher such meaning in the pieces? There is a body of knowledge, a culture of the discipline that is transmitted and shared in certain knowledge traditions. Through them, we can gain access to certain levels of decryption. We need those discipline-dependent conventionalisms to decipher meaning. As Goodman said, those looking to understand that which is represented must be acculturated with a system of representation that have been used to produce it. A circle can stand for many things. In the left, we can see what can be a representation of the sphere of Pascal. According to Pascal, what is a brightening sphere whose center is everywhere and its circumference nowhere. The sphere with a center everywhere and surface nowhere was one of the most used mathematical images in theology. This story is told by Jorge Luis Borges in his essay, The Sphere of Pascal. On the right, we can see a representation, please correct me if I'm wrong, a stable circular orbit for a Schwarzschild black hole. Equally, a square can represent, for example, a Minkowski spacetime or a Schwarzschild black hole. We see how the same isomorphic structure can represent many things in different ways. So there must be a key of translation, a classificatory schema. The more abstraction there is, the more conventionalisms we require to ground meaning. At a high level of pure mathematics, it is very difficult to say anything physically meaningful about the use of conventions to construct the results. However, Coriel explains, in the case of the model of an hydrogen atom, the framework is much less abstract. There are a lot less degrees of freedom. Since the model is much less abstract, it provides a strict scope of application. The more abstract, the more dimensionality there is at the abstract level. Math serves as a mediation between some of the ways that our concepts may make non-trivial contact with the world. This fixing is something that must be done on a case-by-case basis. It is not something fixed. We find the same thing happening in art, where different artists will create different languages of expression. Like mathematical terms, the elements of an artist's personal language are tools. We must know them to understand each piece and the practice as a whole. Now, how about Francis Bacon? At the time Bacon was working, there was in the art world a liberation in the means of artistic representation after the semiotic turn brought about by modernism, where forms of depiction were emancipated from its contents. In this context, Bacon tasked himself with the job of reinventing figuration in order to provide the viewer with the brutality of the fact. Realism for Bacon had to be reinvented, referencing Vincent van Gogh's idea of allowing for inaccuracy, deviations, reformings, and alterations that will reveal a truth truer than real. Bacon's approach is not straightforward and not one-dimensional. This figure and the form enables a multifaceted access to the subject matter through synchronicity of elements. Unlike in mimetic conceptions of art, for Bacon, art is not a second-hand experience of the world, but is creation of something in the world. The goal was to bring about the ineffability of certain conceptual targets and make them visually accessible. This could not be achieved through the literality of figuration. The aim was the elimination of the narrative, those aspects that pertain to specific instances of historical occurrences. For Bacon, great art is a way of reinventing what is called fact, a revealing of truth out of the veils that the fact acquires through time. Bacon said, really good art presents truth without obscuration. We see how the practice of painting has moved on from one of simple representation of the material world to a practice of expression of emotions. These elements of chance, accidents, and fluctuations demonstrate that in the mind of the artist, there is no definite linear way of representing. In Bacon, a work that might start by trying to compose a bird might metamorphosize into a cut of meat. Spontaneity and the use of the combination of abstraction and figuration give us an insight into his mind, where forms are excuses to suggest emotion. The disfigurement paradoxically reveals an emotional truth unreachable through the means of plain representation, a way of bypassing the mediation of the intellect and bringing the figurative thing up onto the nervous system more violently and more poignantly. What we see exemplified in the case of Bacon is that we can find truth or an approximation to it because of abstraction and not despite it. When our own minds are sometimes not transparent to even ourselves, abstraction can serve as a fruitful tool to access a realm of emotion sometimes unavailable. Unlike representation in the sciences, where as Suarez puts it, the relation of representation has to be factual, and it cannot involve judgment on the part of agents. We have in Bacon the need for the judgment of the viewer. The emotional reaction is essential to get to the real target of the work. In maths, we saw that there can be meaning or physical significance without representation. Can this also be the case in art? In line figure with hypodermics arranged, what are the black stains in the canvas? The result of accidental drips. They do not intentionally represent anything. Our critic, Robert Melville, describes the ambiguity in Bacon's accidental drips of paint as the most horrifying element of the painting. We know what the syringe means, but what do the amorphous black stains mean? Surely something much more terrifying. Bacon's choice to leave them shows a willingness to express something that is beyond simple representation. The aesthetic experience serves as an attempt to access the truth, maybe one that is even inaccessible or ineffable to the artist itself. The case in science is rather more contentious, where what we find with the aesthetic experience is at best a heuristic rather than an assurance of truth. We can recall Goodman's assertion that almost any picture can represent almost anything. Needs deciphering is the system of representation that connects the target representation to the object. The work of art can connect to different targets through different instantiations in a sort of multiple realizability, where different meanings can be realized by many distinct artistic elements, and different forms can designate the same subject matter, like in mathematical expressions. The disintegration of the figure introduces a level of abstraction that is required to capture that which a simple likeness cannot. It also helps to remove the disguises of the individuals, like social status, self-stylization, and role-playing, that, like Hamlet said, are actions a man might play. The results of scientific representations are taken by some to be an approximation to truth. The work of art serves as a mediation for a message that would only reach us in part, incomplete. In art, perhaps like in science, the best we can hope for is an approximation to truth, to the truth originally intended and felt by the artist. By understanding the conventions used in the abstractions, we can approximate closer to the truth of a work of art. The melting of the figures, Bacon said, is done in order to destruct one specific point of view and thus reach and search for a more universal perspective, similarly to Hepworth's aim. The quality of the aesthetic experience is that of revealing a deeper truth. In the case of science, as Chakravarti says, the different conditions of approximation brought about by abstraction must be understood as different conventions of representation. So concluding, what Hepworth and Bacon were both attempting to was to achieve a greater target of denotation, a universality of representation that would serve as a vehicle for the message. What both artists have in common is that they found this tool in abstraction, where abstraction can be used to bring us closer to the actual target of the piece. This aspect of universality is also present in science, where abstraction allows for a bigger scope of use of the scientific objects. The role of conventions is crucial to grounding meaning when engaging in abstraction. The choices of how to construct a representation, for example, language or medium, and the particular intentions surrounding the choices, they all denote and signify the interests and values of the community, scientific or artistic, that it might be aimed at. And as Goodman said, those looking to understand that which is represented must be acculturated with the systems of representation that have been used to produce it. Thank you.
It's really incredible. And I just wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit more about your own pieces. So now that you've given us all this lovely background about how you think about abstraction, can you tell maybe just a little bit about your process for deciding how to implement your work?
Sure. Well, I'm thinking about everything, but not for you. I'm thinking about what other artists have done, their methods, but ultimately what you do as an artist is you go with what works for you. And like I said before, I just wanted to make something that it was an abstraction, something that for me would reflect kind of the purity and the beauty that attracts me to the subject of the black hole. So I use metal, stainless steel. I use metal quite a lot. I like the austerity and the elegance of the material. I find it very, very attractive. And also I thought, because I was depicting photons, orbits of photons, I thought, I'm not do it in the material that is complete opposite. It's quite like the contrast of using something so solid to describe that. And then, and if I draw with grinder the tool, I just draw and texturize the piece. And yeah, and then the circle is just one of my obsessions. I'm obsessed with circles, I'm obsessed with spheres. And that quote from Dante, if I read it, well, it's just followed me, because I thought, not because I'm religious, but because I find it very beautiful. Yeah.
I wonder, you know, how you're using the Francis Bacon when you point out that there's elements of abstraction and elements of mimesis. I mean, is that exemplary of, say, the expressionists who were after something emotional in their depictions, but not raw mimetic material, or surfaces like impressionists, or volumes and underlying geometries, cubists? I mean, is it that you see throughout the history of modern art, an attempt to navigate between truth about an image and abstraction and mimesis? Or is Francis Bacon in particular the person that you want to use as like, is it a general, is he an emblem of others? Or is it
an emblem of others? And I chose Francis Bacon because I absolutely adore him. And I adore Barbara Hepworth. And I think they both kind of exemplified two parts of my interests. I was going to say me, but parts of my interests. I absolutely adore the geometrical and the purity approach of Barbara Hepworth and her spirituality, and which I can't fully connect, but I can see it there in the same way that I can see it in Bach. So I can see it. He had to believe to create that music. But at the same time, I'm so attracted by Bacon, the rawness and the complete acceptance of our animalistic side. And I find that, you know, so compelling. But they're not special cases. I just chose them because if I had to write about something for a long time, I might as well write about something that I love. So I chose them. But there has been a break, my niece, to something else. Representation is not, you know, it's not, and that kind of, I mean, we have, I put in the slide, I put a picture of Goya, and I think he kind of is like a proto avant-gardist who already had kind of like, I mean, this, that can be a Rothko top. You know, you can kind of start to see how, you know, things are kind of like unraveling into something that goes beyond pure one-to-one similarity representation. And I think there was a discourse between science and the arts that, you know, it's a dance, and they both kind of influence each other. Probably science more art than
Do you have a question? Yeah, but do you have time or not? You spoke about scientists and artists. And I'd like to mention in this respect, Leonardo da Vinci, he worked on shadows and light, used sfumato, and he worked many years on the Mona Lisa. It reminds me of the black hole and the HP project because he changed the Mona Lisa all the time. He improved it and he used the shadows and the light and improved the masterpiece like the HD project. They improve all the time. They use the data and they create an image and they create new algorithms all the time. And every experiment they perform new experiments and they create new images. And that's what Leonardo da Vinci, that's what he did. He created that he did not, the masterpiece was not static, it was dynamic. He changed it all the time until he died. He ended this masterpiece when he died. He started in Florence in 1505 and he created it until he died.
Indeed, and he's one of, there's two kinds of artists in the world.
Yeah, right. He's not, of course, he was from the rain.
The ones that keep going back and the painting's never finished, and then the
Yeah,
other ones
right.
like me, like you finished it, you showed it, and you forget about it. But I mean, he's kind of emblematic. He is emblematic in this case of this methodology of working where art and science can be continuous. And I think that the two disciplines kind of separated. They veered off, but now they're kind of, you know, we're finding very fruitful connections of uniting the two things, which is kind of like what I'm trying to do with my research. I'm trying to unite the two things and see what similarities and what approaches we can borrow from each.
Thank you.